I knew something was terribly wrong the second I saw fresh gray concrete where green grass was supposed to be. The smell of wet cement drifted through the open truck window before I even turned into my driveway, mixing with the faint scent of summer rain that still clung to the air after an afternoon shower. My wife smiled at first, thinking a neighbor must have started a renovation project while we were away on our honeymoon. But that smile disappeared the moment the entire scene came into view. A brand new concrete wall stretched across the edge of my property like it had always belonged there, nearly 6 feet tall and running farther than I could measure with a single glance. A polished metal sign attached to the center proudly announced, "Community Boundary Improvement." I sat motionless behind the steering wheel for several seconds, unable to believe what I was seeing. We had left for our honeymoon 10 days earlier with nothing more dramatic than freshly cut grass and blooming flower beds. We came home to find an entire structure standing across land that had belonged to my family for more than 40 years. My name is Ethan Walker, and everything that happened next began because one small piece of bright orange plastic refused to disappear beneath someone else's mistake. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I walked slowly toward the wall. Every few feet, I noticed fresh tire tracks from heavy equipment, stacks of unused concrete blocks near the roadside, and ribbons still fluttering from temporary wooden stakes, suggesting the construction had finished only hours earlier. My wife quietly followed beside me, her suitcase still sitting in the driveway exactly where we had left it. Across the street, several neighbors watched from their front porches with uncomfortable expressions. One elderly man slowly removed his baseball cap and looked away before I could ask a single question. Another neighbor finally spoke. He told me the Homeowners Association had supervised the entire project during the previous week and celebrated the completion that very morning. According to him, board members claimed the wall would improve neighborhood access and clearly define community boundaries. His voice carried more uncertainty than confidence, as though he already sensed something about the project had never felt right. I walked closer until my hand rested against the cool concrete. The surface was still slightly damp, proving it had only recently cured. Then I noticed something that made every instinct inside me stop at once. Near the base of the wall, almost completely surrounded by hardened concrete, barely 2 inches of bright orange plastic protruded from the ground. I crouched beside it and carefully brushed away loose dust with my fingertips. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing because I recognized exactly what I was looking at. It was an original property survey stake, the same type my father had shown me countless times when teaching me why every inch of land deserved accurate records. Somebody had poured concrete around it instead of removing it. They had literally sealed the evidence into their own construction. I stood back up and looked along the entire length of the wall again, but now I was seeing something completely different. Everyone else saw a finished project. I saw a mistake preserved in concrete. What the Homeowners Association did not know was that my family never trusted memory when ownership could be proven on paper, and somewhere inside a fireproof cabinet in my garage rested every survey, every deed, every county record, and every document connected to this property since my grandfather first signed for it decades ago. Standing there beside that tiny orange marker glowing against fresh gray concrete, I realized I was not looking at the end of a construction project. I was looking at the beginning of a legal story that had already left its first witness buried in plain sight. My wife quietly carried our luggage inside while I walked straight into the garage, pulled the old fireproof cabinet away from the wall, and turned the combination lock that my father had taught me to memorize before I was old enough to drive. The heavy steel door swung open with the same familiar sound I had heard dozens of times growing up. Every folder remained exactly where he had always kept it, labeled in neat handwriting with dates, survey numbers, tax records, permits, and warranty deeds. My father used to tell me that memories faded, neighbors moved away, and stories changed over time, but official records remained exactly where they belonged if someone cared enough to protect them. Long before this neighborhood had sidewalks, decorative entrance signs, or a homeowners association, my grandfather had purchased this land because he believed one day his family would build a life here. He often walked the property with me when I was a boy, stopping beside each survey monument and explaining that a property line was more than an invisible boundary. It was a promise that every owner could depend on if the documents were preserved. At the time, I thought he was simply sharing old stories. Standing in my garage that afternoon with fresh concrete still drying outside, I finally understood why he repeated those lessons so often. I spread the oldest survey across my workbench beside the original warranty deed signed more than 40 years earlier. The faded paper showed every measurement, every monument, and every corner marker exactly as they had been recorded with the county decades before a single house existed nearby. My wife stood beside me reading the survey while I compared it with newer updates completed after we expanded the driveway several years earlier. Every revision matched the original boundaries perfectly. Nothing suggested that ownership had ever changed or that any portion of the property had been transferred to another owner. Still, I wanted official confirmation before making a single phone call. Early the next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office carrying copies of every document my family had preserved. The clerk searched the parcel number, reviewed the recorded chain of title, and printed the most recent ownership records. She smiled politely before sliding the paperwork across the counter. According to every official record maintained by the county, the entire section beneath the newly constructed wall still belonged to me. No transfer had ever been recorded. No easement appeared on the property history. No right-of-way had been granted. The legal description matched my grandfather's original deed almost word for word. I thanked her, placed the certified copies into my folder, and walked back toward the parking lot feeling calmer than I had the day before. Meanwhile, the Homeowners Association seemed eager to celebrate its accomplishment. Their community newsletter featured photographs of smiling board members standing beside the new wall beneath bright blue skies. Their social media page described the project as a successful neighborhood improvement completed on schedule. One post even praised the board for protecting community interests through strong leadership. I quietly saved every photograph, every announcement, and every public statement without responding to any of them. They believed they were documenting a successful construction project. I suspected they were creating a detailed timeline of their own decisions. As I drove home with certified county records resting on the passenger seat beside me, I glanced once more toward the bright orange survey stakes still trapped beneath fresh concrete. My grandfather had trusted those boundaries. My father had trusted the paperwork. Now both of those quiet habits were about to become far more powerful than anyone serving on the Homeowners Association board could possibly imagine. Over the next several days, I discovered that the Homeowners Association had become my most reliable source of evidence without realizing it. Every time they celebrated their new wall, they documented another piece of the story for me. Their community website featured a photo gallery showing board members standing proudly beside the finished structure with bright ceremonial ribbons still attached to temporary posts. Their monthly newsletter included a full-page article describing the project as a permanent improvement that would benefit every resident. One board member uploaded a short drone video that slowly followed the entire length of the wall from above, proudly displaying every section of concrete from one end to the other. I downloaded every photograph, every video, every newsletter, and every public statement before saving multiple copies inside the same fireproof cabinet where my grandfather's records had rested for decades. I never left angry comments. I never argued online. I simply preserved everything exactly as they chose to publish it. Their confidence was becoming part of my evidence. At the same time, I contacted a licensed county surveyor with an excellent reputation for boundary disputes throughout the region. 3 days later, he arrived just after sunrise with a survey truck, total station equipment, GPS receivers, tripods, measuring rods, and copies of the official subdivision plat. He listened carefully while I explained the history of the property, but he stopped me after only a few minutes and smiled politely. He said stories were helpful, but measurements always carried the final word. For the next several hours, he worked quietly across the property, locating original monuments, verifying coordinates, checking historical records, and comparing every measurement against the legal description recorded with the county. My wife watched from the porch while I followed behind at a respectful distance, careful not to interrupt his process. Several neighbors gathered along the sidewalk, curious about the equipment and the bright colored flags that gradually appeared throughout the yard. By early afternoon, the surveyor invited me to stand beside the very same section of wall where the orange survey stakes still protruded through the hardened concrete. He brushed away a small amount of loose debris, exposed more of the marker, and compared its location with the electronic measurements displayed on his equipment. Then he looked up and quietly confirmed exactly what I had suspected from the beginning. The Homeowners Association wall crossed more than 100 feet onto my recorded property. He explained that the original monument had never moved. The concrete had simply been poured around it, preserving the evidence instead of eliminating it. Hearing those words brought no excitement because I had expected the result. What surprised me was how precise everything became once professional measurements replaced neighborhood assumptions. Before leaving, the surveyor handed me a preliminary drawing showing the true property line in bold red ink cutting directly through the newly constructed wall. He promised the certified survey would be completed within a few days and suitable for county review if necessary. That same evening, another notification appeared from the Homeowners Association announcing a weekend community appreciation event celebrating recent neighborhood improvements. The promotional photographs once again featured smiling board members standing beside the wall from multiple angles. I quietly downloaded those images too because every cheerful picture captured the same concrete structure occupying the exact location the surveyor had just documented. By the time the sun disappeared below the trees, I realized the Homeowners Association had unknowingly created two complete records of the same project. One record existed in carefully measured survey data. The other existed in their own public celebration. Both were telling exactly the same story, and neither one favored the people who believed they had already won. The certified survey arrived 2 mornings later inside a large reinforced mailing tube, and I unrolled it across my dining room table with the same care my father always showed when handling important records. Thick black lines outlined the legal boundaries of my property, while a bold red overlay highlighted the exact path of the newly constructed wall. There was no ambiguity anywhere on the page. The concrete structure crossed well into my land for more than 100 feet, and the orange survey stake remained exactly where county records said it should have been decades earlier. My wife quietly studied the map before looking at me with a calm expression that matched my own. Neither of us felt angry anymore. We simply understood that facts were beginning to replace assumptions. That afternoon, I scheduled appointments with the county planning department, the zoning office, and a local real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. I wanted every decision I made from that point forward to rest on professional advice instead of emotion. At the county planning office, an engineer reviewed the certified survey alongside the subdivision plat that had been recorded years before the neighborhood was fully developed. He carefully compared parcel numbers, legal descriptions, and utility maps before rotating his computer monitor toward me. Every digital layer matched the paper documents resting in my folder. He pointed directly at the location of the wall and explained that no public access corridor existed there. The area had never been designated as common property, and there was no county approval authorizing permanent construction across my parcel. My next stop was the zoning office, where another official searched historical files for recorded easements or rights-of-way. Several minutes passed while old records appeared on her screen one after another. Finally, she looked up and shook her head. There were utility easements in other sections of the subdivision, but none affected the portion of my property where the wall had been built. She printed an official record search summary confirming that no easement granted the Homeowners Association permission to occupy that land. By the time I walked into the attorney's office later that afternoon, my folder had become thicker than ever. He reviewed every document without interruption, occasionally making notes in the margin before placing the certified survey beside the county records. After nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair and smiled in a way that suggested he had seen situations like this before. He explained that property disputes often became expensive because people acted too quickly or ignored documentation. In my case, he said the records were unusually consistent. The deed, historical surveys, county files, and new measurements all supported the same conclusion. Then he gave me advice that changed everything. Instead of focusing on what the Homeowners Association had already built, he suggested I think carefully about what I was legally allowed to build on my own property. He reminded me that ownership carried rights as well as responsibilities, provided every improvement followed local codes and obtained the necessary permits. As I left his office, those words stayed with me longer than any legal explanation. I drove home slowly, passing the same concrete wall that had shocked me only days earlier. The orange survey stake still peeked through the hardened concrete exactly as before, silent and unmoved. For the first time since returning from our honeymoon, I was no longer wondering how to prove the boundary. The county had already answered that question. Now I was beginning to understand that the real solution might not involve asking anyone to remove their mistake first. It might begin with using my own property exactly as the law allowed. The next Monday morning, I submitted a complete permit application for a new decorative stone privacy wall along the legal boundary of my property exactly as shown on the certified survey. Every drawing, measurement, material specification, drainage plan, and setback requirement had been reviewed before I ever signed the application. The county building department processed everything without objection because every inch of the proposed construction complied with local regulations. A few days later, I received the approved permit, folded it neatly inside a clear protective sleeve, and placed it beside the certified survey in my truck. I did not hire the largest contractor in town. I hired the one with the strongest reputation for following plans precisely. Before the first piece of equipment arrived, I walked the property with the project manager, the surveyor, and the construction foreman. We stopped beside the familiar orange survey stake that still protruded through the homeowners association wall. The surveyor verified every corner monument one final time before marking the approved construction line with fresh stakes and bright string. The foreman looked at the measurements, nodded once, and told his crew that every stone would follow the survey exactly. That was the only instruction he repeated all day. As excavation began, the steady sound of equipment echoed through the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalks again, watching another wall begin to rise. Although this one followed a very different process. County permits were posted in plain view near the driveway. Inspection schedules were displayed exactly as required. Every delivery receipt, every inspection report, and every approved drawing remained available inside a weatherproof document box mounted near the entrance to the construction site. There was nothing secret about the project because there was nothing that needed to be hidden. By the second afternoon, the Homeowners Association president finally arrived with several board members. Their expressions suggested they expected another argument, but I remained standing beside the permit box with my hands resting comfortably at my sides. She demanded to know why construction had started without board approval. I calmly removed the county permit from its protective sleeve and handed it to her, without saying another word. She read the first page, then the attached survey, before looking back toward the construction crew setting the first rows of carefully placed stone. She insisted that the new wall would interfere with community access, but I quietly explained that the county had already reviewed every relevant record before issuing approval. The project remained entirely on my property according to certified measurements. I wished her a pleasant afternoon and returned to speaking with the foreman about landscaping plans behind the finished wall. Over the next several days, the structure gradually transformed the appearance of my yard. Built from natural limestone with matching stone columns spaced evenly along its length, it looked less like a barrier and more like a permanent feature that had always belonged there. Yet its location created an unexpected consequence. The narrow paved shortcut that the Homeowners Association had apparently intended residents to use behind their own wall no longer connected to the neighborhood, because my legally permitted wall occupied the only remaining access across my property. I had not blocked anyone else's land. I had simply enclosed my own. Residents driving through the subdivision began slowing down to study both walls, standing only a short distance apart. One represented assumptions. The other represented documentation. Every afternoon, sunlight reflected from the orange survey stake trapped beneath. The original concrete, while fresh limestone, rose only a few feet away exactly where the county had authorized it. Without raising my voice, filing a lawsuit, or removing a single block from the existing structure, I had changed the entire conversation simply by building on land that had always belonged to my family. Within a week, the atmosphere across the neighborhood had changed in ways no one could have predicted. People who had barely noticed the original construction suddenly found themselves asking questions that the Homeowners Association had never expected to answer. Every afternoon, I could see small groups of residents standing near the sidewalk, pointing toward the two parallel walls and quietly comparing what they had been told with what they could actually see. The shortcut that many of them assumed would remain permanently available now ended at my newly completed limestone wall, because it had never existed as a legal community access route in the first place. No one was trapped inside the neighborhood, and every home remained accessible through the normal streets that had always served the subdivision. But the convenience the board had promised had disappeared overnight. Curiosity slowly replaced confidence. Several neighbors approached me one evening while I watered the shrubs we had planted along the inside of the new wall. They asked whether I had really received county approval before building it. Instead of offering opinions, I invited them to look at the permit displayed inside the weatherproof document box and showed them the certified survey that established the property line. I also explained that every document could be verified directly through the county offices because I wanted the facts to speak for themselves. One retired engineer carefully studied the survey for several minutes before quietly saying that measurements did not leave much room for debate. His words spread through the neighborhood faster than any rumor ever could. 2 days later, the Homeowners Association announced an emergency board meeting at the clubhouse. The agenda described the discussion as an important update regarding recent property concerns. Residents filled nearly every chair long before the meeting officially began. I chose a seat near the back of the room with a folder resting on my lap. Inside were copies of the original deed, the certified survey, county ownership records, the permit for my wall, photographs of the orange survey stake trapped beneath the Homeowners Association wall, and printed copies of every newsletter article and social media post celebrating the construction. When the board president opened the meeting, she insisted that misunderstandings had created unnecessary confusion within the community. Before anyone else could respond, several residents politely asked whether the board had obtained a professional survey before authorizing the original wall. The room became noticeably quieter. Another homeowner asked whether county approval had been required before construction began. More questions followed, each one calm, respectful, and increasingly specific. When I was finally invited to speak, I walked to the front of the room, placed the certified survey on the table, and slowly arranged the supporting documents beside it. I explained the timeline exactly as it had happened without raising my voice or accusing anyone of acting with bad intentions. Every statement I made could be traced directly to an official document resting in plain view. Then I placed a photograph of the orange survey stake beside the survey drawing, showing its recorded location. Several people leaned forward to compare the two images. No dramatic speech was necessary because the evidence connected every detail by itself. Before the meeting ended, the board reluctantly announced that an independent county inspection would be requested to review the boundary and verify the documentation. As residents quietly filed out of the clubhouse, the conversations sounded very different from those I had overheard only a week earlier. Confidence had given way to careful questions, and for the first time since returning home, I realized the truth was no longer carried only inside my folder. It had begun spreading through the neighborhood one verified document at a time. The county inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning, and by 8 o'clock several White County vehicles had already pulled into the neighborhood. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic announcements, and no raised voices. Instead, the inspectors carried clipboards, measuring equipment, official plats, and survey documents that looked remarkably similar to the copies resting inside my own folder. Watching them work reminded me of something my father often said when we organized family records together. The truth rarely arrived with excitement. It usually arrived carrying paperwork. Residents quietly gathered along both sides of the street as the inspection began. The Homeowners Association board stood together near their concrete wall while I remained beside my limestone wall with my wife, saying very little. The lead inspector introduced himself to everyone present before explaining that the purpose of the visit was simply to verify property boundaries using recorded county documents and physical survey monuments. His calm professionalism immediately changed the atmosphere. This was no longer a disagreement between neighbors. It had become a straightforward review of official records. The inspection team first located the permanent survey monuments referenced in the certified plat. They compared coordinates using modern GPS equipment before stretching measuring tapes between established points exactly as the licensed surveyor had done days earlier. Every measurement was recorded twice. Every reference point was photographed. Every document was checked against the county database. Nearly an hour later, one inspector slowly walked toward the section of concrete where the bright orange survey stake still emerged from the hardened surface. He crouched beside it, carefully brushed away loose dirt, and compared its location with the coordinates displayed on his electronic equipment. Then another inspector joined him. Neither man appeared surprised. They quietly exchanged measurements before marking several locations with temporary flags. Residents leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening, but the inspectors continued working methodically without reacting to the growing curiosity around them. Eventually, the lead inspector gathered everyone together near the center of the property. Holding the certified plat in one hand and the newly recorded measurements in the other, he explained that every independent measurement matched the county's historical records. The original survey monument had never moved. The legal property line remained exactly where it had been recorded decades earlier. The Homeowners Association wall extended well onto my privately owned parcel, and no recorded easement authorized its placement. Hearing those words spoken by a county official carried a very different weight than hearing them from me or from a private surveyor. The discussion that followed remained respectful, but the confidence I had seen on the board members' faces only days earlier quietly disappeared. One resident asked whether the inspection had found any errors in the certified survey I submitted. The inspector answered with a simple sentence that everyone could hear. He said the independent county measurements confirmed the survey's accuracy. Another homeowner asked whether my newly constructed limestone wall complied with the approved property line. The inspector nodded and explained that it remained entirely within my recorded boundaries according to every measurement completed that morning. As the county vehicles prepared to leave, copies of the preliminary inspection findings were provided to both parties, with a final written report scheduled for release after administrative review. I watched the inspectors drive away while sunlight reflected once again from the small orange survey stake that had started this entire chain of events. It had remained in exactly the same place through every argument, every celebration, every meeting, every survey, and every inspection. The only thing that had changed was that everyone else could finally see what it had been quietly proving all along. The county released its final inspection report 4 days later, and everything changed with surprising speed after that. The document contained no dramatic language and no emotional conclusions. It simply listed measurements, parcel numbers, survey references, recorded deeds, and the determination that the Homeowners Association wall had been constructed across privately owned property without any recorded easement or county authorization. The same quiet precision that had guided every survey now appeared in black ink on official county letterhead. Within hours of the report becoming available, the Homeowners Association scheduled another emergency meeting. This time the atmosphere felt entirely different before anyone even entered the clubhouse. Conversations were quieter. People who had once confidently defended the project now carried copies of the inspection report under their arms. I attended with my wife, taking the same seat near the back of the room where I had sat during the previous meeting. I no longer needed to bring a folder filled with evidence because the county had already spoken through its own records. The board president opened the meeting with a noticeably calmer tone than before. Beside her sat the association attorney, who spent several minutes reviewing the findings and explaining the legal responsibilities created by the inspection report. He carefully avoided assigning personal blame, focusing instead on the association's obligation to correct the documented encroachment and minimize additional liability. For the first time since this entire situation began, no one attempted to argue about the location of the property line. That question had already been answered by every survey, every county record, and every official inspection. The only issue remaining was how the association intended to respond. After a lengthy discussion, the board voted to authorize the complete removal of the concrete wall from my property at the association's expense. They also agreed to restore the disturbed portion of the land according to county requirements and reimburse the cost of repairing any damage caused during construction and demolition. The decision passed by a clear majority. Several residents quietly applauded, not because anyone had lost, but because the uncertainty that had divided the neighborhood was finally ending. Early the following week, contractors returned with equipment that looked remarkably familiar from the day I had first come home. This time, however, they worked under county supervision and according to approved restoration plans. Large sections of concrete were carefully removed piece by piece instead of being broken apart carelessly. Dust filled the morning air as machinery hummed steadily, but everything moved with deliberate precision. When the workers finally reached the section surrounding the orange survey stake, they slowed their pace even further. One crew member carefully cleared away the remaining concrete until the original marker stood fully exposed once again. It was weathered but undamaged, exactly where my grandfather's survey had placed it decades earlier. I walked over after the equipment had been shut down and gently brushed the remaining dust from the bright orange plastic with the palm of my hand. It looked almost unchanged despite everything that had happened around it. Several neighbors watched quietly from the sidewalk, and one of them smiled before saying that such a small marker had ended up teaching the entire community a very large lesson. I smiled back because I understood exactly what he meant. My limestone wall remained standing exactly where the county had approved it, while the structure that had once been celebrated with ribbon cuttings, newsletters, and photographs gradually disappeared truckload by truckload. Watching the last concrete panels leave the neighborhood, I realized I had never needed to defeat anyone. I had only needed to let accurate records, patient decisions, and the law follow the same property line that had never moved in the first place. 1 month later, the neighborhood looked remarkably peaceful again, although anyone who had lived through those weeks could still remember exactly where everything had happened. Fresh grass covered the section of land where the concrete wall had once stood, and young trees planted during the restoration had already begun to grow. Every morning, I enjoyed a cup of coffee on the back patio while sunlight reflected across my limestone wall, now surrounded by healthy landscaping instead of construction equipment. The neighborhood sounded different as well. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks again. Neighbors stopped to chat without lowering their voices. The tension that had quietly settled over the community during the dispute had gradually disappeared because uncertainty had finally been replaced with facts. During the following homeowners association election, several new board members were chosen by the residents. One of the first policies they adopted required certified surveys and county verification before any future project involving shared boundaries, landscaping, walls, fences, or community improvements could begin. The change was not announced as a reaction to the past. It was presented as a commitment to protecting every homeowner equally in the future. I appreciated that approach because lasting trust is built by improving procedures instead of repeating old arguments. A few weeks after the election, one of the new board members walked to my front door carrying a neatly organized binder. He explained that the association had completed a full review of its construction approval process and wanted every property owner to receive a copy of the updated guidelines. We spent several minutes talking beside the driveway, not about disagreements, but about the importance of accurate records and respectful communication. Before leaving, he thanked me for remaining patient throughout the entire process. I simply smiled because patience had never been the difficult part. Trusting the documents had been much easier than trusting emotions. Later that afternoon, I opened the same fireproof cabinet in my garage where my father had stored our family records for so many years. I carefully placed the county inspection report beside my grandfather's original deed, the certified survey, the construction permit for my limestone wall, and the photographs documenting every stage of the experience. Looking through those papers felt less like reviewing a conflict and more like reading the next chapter of a family tradition built on responsibility rather than confrontation. Before closing the cabinet, I noticed an old photograph of my grandfather standing beside one of the original survey monuments shortly after purchasing the property decades earlier. He was smiling in exactly the same quiet way I remembered from childhood. I carried the photograph outside and walked to the familiar orange survey stake that remained standing proudly near the restored property line. It was no longer trapped beneath concrete. It simply marked the same boundary it had always marked, unchanged by opinions, meetings, celebrations, or mistakes. I gently pressed the soil around its base and looked across the neighborhood that my family had called home for so many years. People had changed. Leadership had changed. Policies had changed. Even the walls had changed. Only the property line had remained exactly where it belonged from the very beginning. That small orange marker never needed to argue, never needed to raise its voice, and never needed to move. It only needed someone willing to notice it, protect it, and trust what it represented. As I locked the fireproof cabinet one final time that evening, I realized my grandfather had been right all along. Boundaries do not move. People do, and sooner or later the truth gives them every reason to find their way back.